Well, this is a thoroughly lovely evening. I think all of you would doubtless agree at the gifts and talents which have been exposed on this stage. I have something I want to say about Zara, but I'm going to hold off about that for just a moment because there are two other subject matters at the outset that I'd like to reconnoiter. I noticed there was a sort of titter of incredulity and some somewhat cynical applause at the reference of honorary degrees. And I felt I should begin with a confessional. I attended 4 post-secondary institutions of celebrated higher learning over an infinite number of years and managed never, but ever, to acquire a degree. I therefore spent my entire adult life shamelessly lusting after honorary degrees. And it has served me well, although I'm prepared to offer them for sale at a discounted price. And I want you to know that there is a tactical and strategic dimension to this. It's not an accident. Whenever I'm invited to speak within a university environment and there's some prestigious person in the audience, a dean, a vice president, a chancellor, I always end my remarks by saying that it would grieve me deeply if I left the university without the promise of an honorary degree. In the language of my people, the sheer chutzpah of speaking that way causes a kind of indecent cardiac arrest. And sure enough, 3 or 4 weeks later, I get a letter which says, Mr. Lewis, in response to your request, the university is pleased to honor you a degree, or to offer you a degree. And so I don't want you to think that it's all entirely accidental. The second thing I wanted to mention was Bill Davis. And you cannot imagine what a splendid thing it is for me to be in Brampton. I sat in the Ontario legislature for 15 years when the then Premier spoke of Brampton virtually every day of his political life. It was an obsession verging on a kind of traumatic apoplexy. And I must say I never fully understood it, although all of us in the legislature at the time vastly appreciated it. And here I am, firmly in my dotage, pleased to be here, but also pleased to tell you that my years in the legislature opposite Premier Davis, we were ideological opposites, profound ideological opposites, were in many ways some of the best years of my life. It's quite extraordinary when you can engage in kind of splenetic debate in the legislative apparatus and still like and respect each other. And I never worked with a politician who was so decent, generous, thoughtful. I disagreed with him often, but it is an extraordinary commentary on the legacy of integrity which he left and which I think Brampton demonstrated the appreciation for with the key to the city. But I have to tell you that it is one of the loveliest recollections of my life. And we remain very good friends to this day. And I love the guy. I like him much, much more than I like many of my New Democratic colleagues. And I want you all to know that when you compare it to the fratricidal politics of today, those days in the 60s and 70s when we sat in the legislature were days of thoughtful and useful political engagement. And it was such a pleasure to think back, and I don't know whether it will ever be restored given the encrusted Philistines who occupy so many of the seats of parliaments today. In any event, I'm really struck. I loved so much of what Zara said. I haven't heard that kind of emphasis on people and their engagement in a very long time. There were moments of apprehension on my part. She shattered the Blue Jays mythology completely, and that is unsettling. And the idea that you could deal with government with fun and enjoyment is something I shall have to reconnoiter over time. For me, it would be something close to a miraculous metamorphosis, but maybe that's possible. But what I really loved was the human-centered urbanism. What a delicious phrase that is. And the first slide of Start with People. And it had a tremendous resonance with me because of the language that was used. I want to remind you, people closest to the problem have the best idea of how to solve it. Lived experience is the best expertise. And as I sat listening, I was thrown back to my years trekking through Africa, where every country felt like a graveyard, and where the pain and the anguish was so intense that it was palpable. And one of the grave problems in dealing with it was that all of the responses to HIV and AIDS were top down. They were made by governments, they were made by pharmaceutical companies, they were made by cerebral scientists, they were made by people who never really engaged directly with those on the ground coping with the despair around them. And one of the reasons that we've made tremendous advances in dealing with such an infectious disease is because finally the world understood that the experts were the people who were living with HIV. And if you wanted to understand how to solve this excruciating agony of country after country with millions infected, you had to talk to the experts. And that the people who were dealing with antiretroviral drugs and with infection were the experts. And the more you talked to them, the more you understood what should be done. And the tremendous shift now, the qualitative shift where we're finally making inroads into overcoming the pandemic, that has happened because we turned to the people in the communities and on the ground, at the grassroots, who knew the answers. And as I listened to Zara tonight, I was thinking that this gestalt, this sense that if you go to the people in the community and they are strong enough and determined enough and resilient enough to engage, then everything changes. Then it's possible to pull off a great deal. And I love that, Zara. I love that about what you said, and I took it to heart. I'm invited to address in Brampton issues related to climate change and the environment and your mosaic and 2040. And I want to admit, as you could well understand, I hope that I'm largely a complete ignoramus about the minutiae of Brampton and the way it works. But I do know, thanks to Rowena and Rowena Santos, your counselor, and the mayor and others, I do know that you have a climate change emergency declaration that, as the mayor said earlier, it was subscribed to and endorsed by the entire council. And I want to make a suggestion which is kind of unorthodox. And presumably it may fall on deaf ears, but I want to make it anyway. I think Brampton should attempt to become the model for dealing with climate change in Canada. The city, which is the model city that sets itself up to be seen as the premier edifice dealing with global warming in a way which transforms not only the society of Brampton, but becomes a kind of model to be emulated in Canada and possibly all around the world. It would be a terribly thrilling proposition. I point out to you that no other city in Canada is claiming that position. And if you look around the world, you can find Sydney, Australia, Boston, Seattle, Reykjavik, Barcelona, Cape Town. You don't have to be a city of several millions. You can be a city of many hundreds of thousands, as is the case in Brampton, and you can design a kind of architecture of intervention around climate change, which then elevates Brampton to a position of centrality in the country. And it would be an extraordinary moment because the whole world is thinking about the nature of climate change and what to do about it. And if in Brampton you embraced a kind of Green New Deal as part of the mosaic, it could have a most extraordinary impact. You've got a population which is large enough. You've got an urban and suburban mix. You have a huge multicultural diversity. You have a progressive council. My God, where do you find a progressive council these days? What other city in Canada has a progressive council? This is almost too much for my frail psyche to absorb, that you could have a council which has progressive instincts. And you have a civil society which over the couple of years or more dealing with the mosaic you want to create for Brampton 2040, you've had an engagement which is most unusual. So all of the elements are there. And I would love to see Brampton suddenly inserted into the international scene. I mean, why shouldn't there be a representative from Brampton? Maybe there was, but I suspect not. A representative from Brampton, from the council, or from some citizens group who attends a major international conference in Madrid where they're discussing climate change and they're looking at the possibilities for cities as well as for other possible interventions. Why shouldn't you have someone attending the World Economic Forum in Davos, where climate change becomes the centerpiece of a very significant and serious discussion? This is the kind of thing which can electrify a city when you come back with a series of proposals that can be implemented. What about inviting Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, who has now been asked by the United Nations to be the climate change intervener with the entire private sector? Why not? And he's a Canadian. Why not bring him to Brampton and sit down and talk about the private sector as well as civil society and the public sector in the amalgam of dealing with global warming? Because that's now his incipient job. There are cities gatherings around the world dealing with climate change and global warming where Brampton could have a seat at the table, could have someone present so that the city of Brampton gradually gathered around it the aura of expertise and of determination and of caring. I personally would love to see a city like this. You're not even going to have any serious challengers. It's a hard job, it's a hard slog, of course, but it's a wonderful potential dimension as you look at creating the new Brampton that everybody seems to want to create as you graduate from what was into what can be. I even think of what is called UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, which on a regular basis holds very serious seminars and meetings on urban architecture and on urban planning and on the impact of climate change. And why shouldn't Brampton begin to say, we want to be represented? We have a series of propositions which are consistent with the priorities you've set out. Why the devil shouldn't we be a part of it? Now, I recognize very strongly that there are distractions. I mean, right now, the whole world in one way or another is taken up with the coronavirus. And a large chunk of the world is taken up with impeachment proceedings in the United States. But we're headed into another obsessive period around climate. The failure of the International Climate Conference in Madrid last December, when the United States and China and India and Brazil and Australia made it clear that they were not going to reduce seriously the emissions of fossil fuels, and everybody left the conference feeling that somehow the world continued to be on the wrong track. That means that over the next year, as we head to a conference at the end of this year, there's going to be endless engagement and discussion. Similarly, around Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg has not given up, not by a long shot, as she showed at the World Economic Forum a couple of weeks ago. But the emergence of these young climate activists, these young climate strikers, these young people who have this passion to rescue the world from self-destruction, that's really an encouraging phenomenon, and it means that that drum roll of concern will be patterned over and over again in the next year or two or three. And all you have to do, and I feel almost self-conscious saying it, all one has to do is look at the wildfires in Australia, or look at the recent earthquake off the coast of Cuba near Jamaica, or look at the extraordinary onset of locusts in East Africa, now absolutely clobbering Kenya and Somalia and gradually moving into Uganda and Sudan, destroying so much of the agricultural landscape that we're now talking about famine in those countries already. And all of the scientific analysis suggests that the locust hordes, so intense that you can't even see through them when they descend, the locust hordes are a part of the phenomenon of global warming and what happened to the warming of the oceans and the availability of birth and growth of locusts. Anybody who hasn't read the remarkably excellent piece just today in the Globe and Mail, written by Jeffrey York, the African correspondent, about the locust foray, should do so, because it's not just scary, it is a mark of what we're coping with. As you may know, in the fall, before the federal election, David Suzuki and I crossed Canada and spoke in 5 universities. And it was a thrilling exercise, partly for me a thrilling exercise because I think David Suzuki is one of the great icons of this country. And he is just the loveliest, most gentle, most generous and decent guy I've met in a long time. So to travel with him and listen to him, because his knowledge is absolutely encyclopedic. But it was extraordinary to see the way young people reacted and to have the sense that we weren't speaking into some kind of miasma of irrelevance. There was real response. And in those speeches, I made a point, forgive me for being self-indulgent for a moment, that back in June of 1988, just before I left the United Nations definitively, I was given the job by Brian Mulroney, then the Prime Minister obviously, to chair what was the first ever climate change conference internationally. It was held in Toronto at the end of June in 1988. I don't want to pretend for a moment that I had any expertise. I had none at all. All I was doing was simply chairing the meeting, and that was almost accidental because of the Prime Minister, but you sure as the devil learned a lot. And at the end of it, we had 300 scientists and activists and politicians from all around the globe at that meeting. At the end of it, we issued a conference statement. And I want to read from the first paragraph. Quote, "Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to a global nuclear war. The Earth's atmosphere is being changed at an unprecedented rate by pollutants resulting from human activities. These changes represent a major threat to international security and are already having harmful consequences over many parts of the globe. Far-reaching impacts will be caused by global warming and sea level rise, which are becoming increasingly evident as a result of continued growth in atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The best predictions available indicate potentially severe economic and social dislocation for present and future generations, which will worsen international tensions and increase risk of conflicts among and within nations. It is imperative to act now." 1988, over 30 years ago. And I want to remind you that that clarion call, so carefully etched, was accompanied by a litany of suggested interventions around renewables, around land, around water, around retrofitting, around all of the things we care about in response to climate, and none of which was ever implemented. I mean, it was one of the most extraordinary moments of negligence in the continued negligence of humankind around this phenomenon. And David, who understands these things far better than I do, feels that had the world taken hold of that at that moment in time, it would have made all the difference. But absolutely nothing was done. And it's heartbreaking to think back on it and to compare that with what we are dealing with today. Now, I wanted to quote that to you as a kind of context, because in the 32 years since, we've had one alarm after another about the gradual deterioration of our resource base and humankind and what global warming is doing to one population after another. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, has issued warning after warning, year after year, until last year it said to the world, you have 12 years left. If you can make it to 2030 with very systematic changes between now and then, that it's entirely possible that the planet will be saved. But if you can't, then no one can imagine the Armageddon which is looming. And we're not on track. We're simply not on track. That's why I'd love to see a city like Brampton galvanize public attention in a concrete and doable way. I hate being apocalyptic. I'm not a natural catastrophic person. I have elements of hope in my soul, although those elements dim pretty quickly. But I do want to say that we're in a terribly perilous moment. I have 4 grandsons. Michelle and I, my wife and I, think of them often and wonder, what in God's name are they going to inherit in this world? What are we bequeathing to them? Failure after failure. A numbskull in the White House who won't even acknowledge the reality of climate change and is introducing perverse policies across the board, all of which will ultimately designate a world in which we can't live. There's been a recent remarkable book called The Uninhabitable Earth, which describes the consequences of our abysmal paralysis. And I wanted to say, because it's just struck me, I guess, as a democratic socialist, I live with the feeling and the fervor that there've got to be ways to civilize and change society, and that we don't have to run pell-mell down this road of self-destruction, but that's what we're doing. And even since October, November, when David and I finished wandering across the country, we've had a ricocheting drought and rain in southern Africa, consigning countries like Mozambique and Zambia and Zimbabwe to terrible bouts of famine, which appear now to be permanent, some 50 million people at risk. We had the highest carbon dioxide emission levels in 2019 in human history, despite the fact that there was so much discussion and talk about reducing discharge of carbon from oil, gas, and coal. You know what's happened to the Amazon forest. Almost 4,000 square miles of that forest cover has been lost in the course of the last couple of years, and particularly since the new right-wing, reactionary, antediluvian government of Bolsonaro has been in power. The ice sheets in West Antarctica and East Antarctica and Greenland are disappearing far more quickly than even the most knowledgeable scientists predicted. This is all in the last 3 months. The coral bleaching is now beyond repair in so many parts of the world. India, a recent study by the World Bank showed, will face by the year 2050 a tremendously accelerating poverty because of the constant movement between excessive temperatures and overwhelming floods. Jakarta, a massive city, is actually sinking so that the government of Jakarta, that municipal government, has decided that they'd better find an alternative site to move millions of people. Mexico and Bangladesh, representing respectively Latin America and South Asia, have decided that they're going to be reliant on coal, whatever the world may say, and they have patterns of opening new coal mines that make one shudder and approximate in intensity and, frankly, recklessness what is happening in China, where for all of the promises about doing something about climate change, new coal plants are opening month after month. The United Nations in the year 2015 moved from what they called the Millennium Development Goals, 8 goals which were fashioned in the year 2000 and were to be achieved by the year 2015, and along came 2015 and they hadn't been achieved, so the United Nations got together and said, we'll do the Sustainable Development Goals. We won't have 8, we'll have 17 with some 169 specific targets. And those Sustainable Development Goals cover hunger and poverty and gender and equality and climate. And everyone who is analyzing what has happened between the year 2015 and 2020 sees that we are not on target in any of the significant goals. And this, for me, is the imprimatur of obviousness. The world promised the developing countries, who aren't responsible for climate change, but can't cope with it. The world promised the developing countries, that is, the donor nations promised the developing countries, that by the year 2020, they would raise $100 billion a year for the mitigation of global warming in societies which were otherwise impoverished. $100 billion a year by 2020. In total, they have raised $10.3 billion. You see, when it comes to the spirit of colonialism, expressed or unexpressed, the willingness to consign whole societies to a kind of oblivion and to immense and incalculable hardship comes easily to donor countries. And even a country like Canada has failed to do what many have expected it to do. So at the same time that all of this is happening in the last 2 or 3 months, and we're noting it and we're marking it down, there have, of course, been some significant and one might say even spectacular moves forward. The climate change activists, the Extinction Rebellion people in the United Kingdom who have been engaged in nonviolent demonstrations. And in the United States, the emergence of the Green New Deal. Now, this is really an exciting moment, and one doesn't know whether, as a result of the Democratic contest for the presidency, it will be imperiled. But at the moment, it has been endorsed by Bernie Sanders, and it's been endorsed by Elizabeth Warren, and it has a growing support. And if Sanders should win in Iowa next week and in New Hampshire the week after, then the momentum around the Green New Deal, and therefore around saving the planet, will have received a tremendous boost in fortunes. And we have a kind of parallel in Canada. It's called the Leap Manifesto. And the Leap Manifesto is really our Green New Deal. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I suppose I have a kind of intellectual conflict of interest, because the Green New Deal was originally fashioned by my daughter-in-law, Naomi Klein, who will be known to many of you, and my son, our son, Avi. And they are traveling with Sanders and speaking with Sanders and attempting to achieve in Canada what looks as though they're on the verge of in the United States, particularly with people like AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, supporting it. This is an extremely exciting development within the United States. But I want to make a point about the LEAP, understanding that there are many, the LEAP Manifesto, there are many differences of opinion and political disputation. It talks about a transformation of society. It's not just directed to one intervention or another. It's directed to a mosaic, using your phrase, of ingredients which will transform the society in which we live. And in that sense, it's tremendously exciting. It talks about a Canada based on caring for each other. That's the phrase. And a Canada which has a post-carbon future. Well, that fits nicely with Brampton, doesn't it? You've said you'll reduce your carbon discharge by 20% in 2024, by 30% for 2030, and by 80% in 2050. Yes, I read a lot of the material that was sent to me by the municipality of Brampton. Much of it was impenetrable and indigestible, but I faithfully read it all, and I'm prepared to disgorge elements of it in the last few minutes of this endless address. But I do want to make the point that those elements which were included in the LEAP and in our Green New Deal, indigenous rights because of the nature of land and oil and natural gas, everywhere David and I spoke, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, on the stage with us, speaking at the same length and with the same prominence, was a leading Indigenous woman activist, because we wanted to convey to the world that we understood that you couldn't separate the Indigenous reality from the struggle around climate. And finally, the discussion of economic justice, which speaks to jobs, because you can't have a transformative economy and leave people who have to shift from one occupation to another behind. By 2050, we hope to have a society which is 100% renewable. And there are now a number of cities and indeed a couple of countries that are talking about 100% renewable for energy by 2050. We want to have an energy democracy which puts energy in the hands of communities, not unlike the fabric that Zara pointed out earlier. There's got to be the training of workers. So if you're moving from fossil fuels to renewables, whether it's sun or wind, you want to make sure that people don't lose their jobs, but that there is a very serious attention paid to the costs and the possibilities. We want to emphasize infrastructure. We want to get rid of trade deals that sustain extractive projects, because the world is learning ineluctably, you cannot turn it around, that ultimately we're not going to use coal and oil and natural gas, that these fossil fuels are declining in value and in utility, even though there are some outliers like Mexico, Bangladesh, China who insist on maintaining it. Gradually, we're going to be shifting, and ultimately we're going to have to leave some of those fossil fuels in the ground. And it's important to expand the non-carbon sectors of society. I love this about the Green New Deal. You've got to expand caregivers, teachers, social workers, the arts, childcare. All of these areas which are fundamental to a decent and civilized and sophisticated fabric of social interaction, which are neglected, but which don't really have a carbon center. So if we can deal with all of these elements in a way which gives them centrality, we can make a huge difference in the world. And that's why the Leap Manifesto and the Green New Deal are worth reading and thinking and talking about. Now, you may not agree with all of it, but I believe that Brampton is on their way. You see yourselves as a green city. You're looking for alternatives to cars. You've spent all kinds of time talking about cycling and walking and public transit. You've got this electric bus project underway, which is unique in so many parts of this country. You have this extraordinary civic engagement. You're retrofitting and talking of retrofitting buildings. You have a partnership with Sheridan College around energy. Who does that? Who has that? Tell me another city that is engaged so directly in a partnership with a university or a college. That's a tremendous plus for Brampton. You have the Community Energy and Emission Reduction Program. It's a mouthful, but it portends nothing but that is other than positive, because it speaks exactly to the energy reduction which is required, and it is an exact mirror of the international priorities which are ignored by so many others. And I noted as I read the fine print of the documents, my God, you write a lot, you people, that you have 50 energy conservation projects, you have 13 renewable energy conservation projects, you have 52 electrical vehicle charging stations, you want to plant 1 million trees, you want to have a university. What a lovely, delectable thought. Why not? There are so many universities now around the province that are around the country and around the province that are antediluvian and pre-Paleolithic. It's time to have a university which is modern and progressive, and you could even have an institute. You could have the Bill Davis Institute for Political Decency. Now that would be. That would be a lovely touch to have in Brampton. But you deserve a university, particularly since the spectacularly informed Premier has ruled out the extension of Ryerson. So it would be nice to have an alternative looming on the books. You want an Institute for Sustainable Brampton. You have rent-a-parks and community gardens and biodiversity preservation under the heritage restoration. You have affordable housing that you're looking to. You're even looking to emphasis on mental health. I mean, Brampton verges on angelic perfection. And I want to encourage you to see the city as a model in all of these areas, which you've already begun to introduce. I mean, this is a good council. And it's a council which reflects the diversity of Brampton, and it's a council which has put in place, as a result of the extraordinary process of consultation in which you involved upwards of 11,000 people, you've pulled everything together in a way that suggests that you don't have to articulate it any longer, you just have to do it. I'm a romantic. I think it would be just out of this world to have one city somewhere in this country that said to the rest of the country, look, the greatest hazard, the greatest alarm, the greatest risk for humankind is climate change. We understand that. And so we're going to move heaven and earth to combat it. But more than that, we're going to succeed, and we're going to emerge as a model of intellectual clarity and moral sensibility for the rest of the country. And hereafter, people are going to talk of Brampton in reverential terms. Thank you.